Well, welcome everyone. This is Dennis Stone, Director of the Center for Advocacy and Social Justice at the Jacksonville Urban League. I'm pleased to welcome all of you tonight for our monthly conversation on racial healing and reconciliation. Our speaker tonight is Professor Alex Vitale from Brooklyn College. He's an expert in policing, a sociologist, and writer on the topic. And I can't think of a better conversation to have than this one. We've had several at the Urban League that has opened our eyes to a lot of things, and I suspect Professor Vitale will do as well. Also wanted to recognize the fact that we have our president, Richard Danford, with us, and several of our interns are also attending. And I want to thank Jamie Krasnogor, our intern coordinator, for all the work she does and for helping co-host this. And with that, I will turn it over to you, Professor Vitale.
Thank you, Dennis. And I see you're strapped in for a lively conversation there. You're all. Well, I appreciate the invitation, the opportunity to come and talk to you all. I was in Jacksonville about 4 or 5 years ago when my book, The End of Policing, sort of first came out, and spoke both at the university there and in the community, and had a chance to meet with a number of community leaders to talk about some of the issues there. So while I'm no expert on Jacksonville, I do have some familiarity with some of the issues here. But I'm going to try to talk really about some of these issues from a national perspective, and to get a sense of an overview here. So, and to put things in a little bit of historical perspective. So, following the protests in Ferguson, Missouri, after the police killing of Mike Brown, we were told, don't worry, we're going to fix policing. We're going to reform policing. President Obama created a task force on 21st century policing that made dozens of recommendations about how to fix policing through professionalization, improve training, hiring, oversight, fixing use of force policies, etc. And a number of departments around the country embraced all or some of these reforms. Here in New York, police were given body cams, diversity training, implicit bias training. But unfortunately, we really haven't seen much in the way of positive results following from the huge investments that went into this. The officers involved in the killing of George Floyd in Minneapolis had implicit bias training, de-escalation training, mindfulness training, were wearing body cameras, were operating under a new, more restrictive use of force policy, were operating under a new bystander policy that required that officers intervene if they see misconduct by a fellow officer. They were operating under a new early warning accountability system. And none of it made any difference. The officers involved in the killing of Tyree Nichols in Minneapolis similarly had received many of these same kinds of training, were wearing body cameras. They were, they were almost entirely non-white officers involved. The leadership of the Memphis Police Department is non-white, and it just didn't make any difference. So why is it that these reforms are not producing the kinds of changes that people hoped for? Well, let's take a look at some of the things that have been proposed and why they're not working. One of the most popular reforms that's been implemented all across the country and increasingly internationally is so-called implicit bias training. This is the idea that the problems of racial disparity in American policing are the result of unconscious and unintentional racial biases that affect the discretionary decision-making of primarily white officers that could lead to excessive use of force, higher arrest rates, etc., of people of color. Well, this training has not worked. The research consistently shows that it makes no measurable impact on the behavior of officers. And really, how could it? It assumes that the problems of racial disparities are a result of, unconscious discretionary decision-making by individual officers. Well, the first problem with this is that it ignores the existence of explicit bias in American policing. When we look for it, we find it. The chat boards, the Facebook pages, the text messages, we routinely find explicitly racist behavior, attitudes, and involvement in white supremacist organizations by some police officers. And this is not new. If we look at the history of policing, it has always been closely intertwined with groups like the KKK, the John Birch Society, that harbor extremely radical racist viewpoints. But it is a mistake, I think, to reduce the problems of the racial disparities in American policing to individual racism on the part of specific officers. In many of the big city police departments, a majority of officers now are non-white. The leadership of many big cities police departments is non-white. And if we look at the demographics of policing as a whole, they're not that radically different than the demographics of the country anymore. So we've come a long way in diversifying policing, but again, it has not produced the desired results. But there's a bigger problem here than just individual level explicit racial bias, and that is a problem of institutional bias. The fact is that the institution of policing has been one of the primary tools in the history of this country in reproducing racial inequality. If we look at the origins of our police departments across the US, we see them created in direct response to challenges to white supremacy. Whether it is the colonial police forces of the American West, like the Texas Rangers, or urban police forces in the North, which are created primarily to manage the influx of immigrant populations in the period about 150 to 100 years ago. And those early immigrant populations were considered non-white. Italians, Irish, Jewish populations were racialized, and policing in the North played a central role in policing the color line between these groups. In the South, the connection is much more obvious. We see that policing emerges directly out of the dynamics around slavery in rural areas in relationship to so-called slave patrols. But in the big cities of the South, cities like Charleston and Savannah and New Orleans, policing emerges to manage urban slave populations, which in these centers, slaves actually worked outside the home of their owners. They traveled each morning to wharves, warehouses, and workshops to earn wages that were then returned to their owners. Charleston, I argue, had what I'd consider to be the first modern police force in the United States. By the late 1780s, they already had a uniform, professional, 24-hour law enforcement-oriented department called the Charleston City Watch and Guard, but the laws that they were primarily enforcing were the laws of slavery. Black slaves outnumbered whites on the streets of Charleston every morning and every late afternoon as they traveled to and from work. And policing was developed, modern policing was developed in Charleston to manage this mobile enslaved population. Even after the end of slavery, we see police play a central role in managing Jim Crow in the South, Juan Crow, a form of Juan Crow in places like South Texas and parts of California, and managing the color line of the northern ghettos in the wake of the Great Migration north of freed Blacks. So this institution was designed and functioned with the purpose of reproducing racial inequality. And that legacy is not something of the far distant past of 1789. You know, these are things that were actively and consciously and explicitly done in most of our lifetimes. And there are people in those institutions who were part of that explicit use of policing to control race relations. So then to imagine that a couple of hours of diversity training are somehow going to fundamentally transform these institutions seems incredibly naive to me. And the research shows that it just doesn't work. But there's an even bigger problem. There's an even bigger problem here. Even if we could root out the individual racist police officers, even if we could change the institutional culture of policing, we have a problem of structural racism. And that is a problem that stems from forces outside the police department. This is about a set of politics that defines the problems of Black and brown and poor communities as problems of quote unquote crime to be managed by policing, courts, jails, and prisons. So that certain kinds of problems get defined a certain way and treated a certain way. When folks in wealthier, whiter, leafy suburbs have social problems, they don't call the police. The police don't get involved. The behaviors that they engage in are often not labeled as criminal behavior. And they're less likely to engage in the kinds of behaviors that we label crime because they don't have the deficits of employment, income, stable housing, healthcare, mental health services, substance abuse services, and all the rest that characterize our poorest communities. And so that decision to turn the problems of Black and brown communities into crime problems to be managed by policing places an additional burden on those communities in a variety of forms. We saw, for instance, in Ferguson, the way in which fines and fees were being used to basically extract wealth from the poorest parts of the community to subsidize government so that the better off areas didn't have to pay taxes. We see that the use of like automobile fines and fees is heavily disproportionately targeted at the already poorest communities and involves extracting, millions of dollars in resources out of those communities. But the burden is also a burden of constant police harassment and abuse, at least for some parts of the community. We see this in pretextual traffic stops, stop and frisk operations, the kind of everyday suspicion, discourteous behavior, etc. Because police are told that they are waging a war on drugs and a war on crime and a war on terror and a war on immigrants and a war on gangs. And this means that they approach the community as a potential source of enemy combatants. But the police didn't create these wars, and they're not going to be able to stop them. These are political problems. And what the demand on the streets has been the last several years is to reject this idea that if we give the police more money for more training, that some, and more technology and more oversight and more policy changes, that this is somehow going to change the fundamental nature of the institution. But as long as the mission of policing remains unchanged, no amount of implicit bias training, de-escalation training, or body cameras is going to make any significant difference. So let's just look at the case of Memphis for a second. City leaders there were confronted by some very troubling crime patterns. There were shootings, there was violence. The problem is that city leaders there really have no plan to deal with entrenched racialized poverty in Memphis. They have no plan to fix the schools. They have no plan to fix the stock of housing. They have no plan to make sure there are adequate supports for families, for youth in crisis. So when there's a problem of an uptick of violence or robberies or other types of crime, the tool that they have available to cover up these fundamental failures of policy is policing. It provides a kind of theater of action. We're doing something. And of course, that's why they named the special unit they created to respond to these crime problems the Scorpion Unit. That was a name that was designed to be part of the theater of appearing to do something. Now, this puts communities in a real bind because communities need something to be done. And they have been told for decades that the only tool, the only resource that's available for them in a period of crisis is policing. Now, they may ask to have community centers opened up. Memphis, in the last 20 years or so, has seen about a dozen community centers closed. Youth facilities shut down, right? The community asks, well, why can't we have a youth facility? Why can't we have after-school programs for our kids? Why can't we have drug treatment on demand? Why can't we have high-quality community-based mental health services? But the city says, no, you can't have any of that, but if you'd like something, we'll give you policing. And so when confronted with this choice, this false choice of policing or nothing, many people in desperation will latch onto policing as the solution. But then they get Tyree Nichols. And of course, Tyree Nichols was not the first person to be brutalized by that unit. We now know that there were many prior cases that just didn't result in a death or weren't caught on video in the same way, and the unit continued to chug right along. So now the question is, what do we do about this? What do we do about this? How do we get ourselves out of this mess? Well, the first thing we do is we quit wasting our political energy and capital demanding police reforms that aren't going to deliver, that just give the police more money, more resources, and more political legitimacy. And instead, we start to make demands of the kinds of things that people in communities think will actually help to produce safety for them. Which means we got to talk to them, we got to ask them, but we've got to ask them in a way that empowers them to talk about what they would really like, that says, look, let's put everything on the table. Let's get beyond this false choice of policing or nothing. And this is going to require some political transformation to make this possible. It means having elected officials who are willing to put everything on the table, who are willing to take a fresh look at what kinds of interventions are available to produce real public safety, to create safe, healthy, sustainable communities. Because for so long, poor communities, especially poor communities of color, have just been largely abandoned. And that abandonment has been managed through ever more intensive and invasive and violent and deadly policing. You know, we've been doing this police reform thing for a decade, and police killed a record number of people last year in the modern period. So this is clearly not working. So what is working? Well, let me give you some examples. Not far from here in Newark, New Jersey, the mayor there understood the limits of unleashing the police to solve all the problems of Newark, New Jersey. And it's a city that's got a lot of problems. So he took money directly out of the police budget to create a new Office of Violence Prevention and Trauma Recovery. Violence Prevention and Trauma Recovery. Now, they didn't just go out and create some new bureaucracy. What they did is that they acted as contract managers and provided technical assistance for existing organizations already in the community doing community-based violence reduction work. But these new resources allowed them to increase staff, improve training, provide resources for young people in crisis in a way that these kinds of shoestring community groups just weren't able to do. And certainly not to the scale that was needed. And the results have been very positive. They have seen significant reductions in shootings and homicides in Newark. They're very happy with it. I was asked to go out there last year and to visit with them to see the work that's happening. The mayor came out. They're very happy with the decision they've made, and it's making Newark a better place to live. And it's about reducing their reliance on policing and giving more power and resources to communities to solve their problems internally. A lot of this is based on the so-called credible messenger model that involves hiring people from within the community who have themselves had a history of involvement in street life, gangs, violence, etc., but who've made a change in their life and who are in a position to talk to the next generation of young people from a position of mutual understanding and mutual respect, rather than have someone like me stand up on the stage in a school and wag my finger at them and tell them not to carry guns or use drugs, because that doesn't work. They need to hear that message from people who have shared their kinds of life experiences and who can act as a model and help guide them into a better kind of future, which includes connecting them to things like trauma counseling. Because one of the things we know about young people who commit acts of violence is that they have been the victims of violence. They themselves have been victimized either at home or in the community. They have experienced significant life traumas, so-called adverse childhood experiences, that set them up for the kinds of violence that we see. And routinely, when I talk to like middle school teachers, they know who these kids are because they're acting out in school, they're failing at school, and the teachers have no resources except to call the school police officer and to try to drive the kid out of school, where they end up in the criminal legal system and eventually prison, the so-called school to prison pipeline. What's another example? Well, Albuquerque, New Mexico has created Albuquerque Community Safety. They've hired teams of outreach workers, mental health workers that are now handling a significant number of 911 calls that were historically handled by the police. Albuquerque had one of the highest rates of police killings per capita of any city in the country. Something had to change. And many of these killings involved people who were homeless, drug involved, and or had a mental health problem. And now, increasingly, cities like Albuquerque, Denver, Portland, Los Angeles, San Francisco, Houston are developing these teams, and the results have been tremendous. Denver's STAR program, the pilot was so successful that they've increased the funding fivefold, rolled it out into more neighborhoods, and recent research shows that the neighborhoods who have these teams not only have less police violence, they have less crime. Because we know that a certain amount of the crime that's occurring in certain communities is occurring in relationship to folks who have untreated and unaddressed mental health problems. And by creating these civilian mental health outreach teams, these people's needs are being more successfully met, and they are committing less crime. And this is proving to be more effective and cheaper than leaving the problem with the police, who, whatever training they've had, whatever efforts they make, are just simply the wrong tool for this problem. In the last few years, over 40 cities have eliminated their school police departments as a result of protests by parents, teachers, and students. These school police departments have been notoriously ineffective at keeping kids safe. The research is uniformly consistent in showing that school policing does nothing to improve the safety of children from either violence within the school or violence from the outside. We need only look at the complete failure of policing in Uvalde to protect those students. There was a school police department. There was a school SWAT team. There was a city SWAT team. There was a border patrol SWAT team, all within minutes of that school, and it made no difference. There were school police on the scene at Parkland High School in Florida when the shooting started. There were school police on the scene when the shooting started at Columbine High School in Colorado, and it just didn't make any difference. By the time the shooting starts, it's too late. It's too late. But research done by the FBI showed that in over 90% of school shootings, people knew before the shooting started that something was going to happen. And in almost every case, nothing was done about it, because we put all our eggs in the basket of target hardening, of filling the schools with people with guns, instead of creating real systems for identifying risks and managing them in a humane way. When young people believe that if they come forward with a concern, that it's going to get turned over to the school police officer, they will not come forward. No one in high school wants to be the kid who turns their friend into the police. We have to take this problem out of the criminal legal system and give it to mental health workers, school counselors, coaches. We need to create robust early warning systems and treatment systems and intervention systems that are prepared to do something about the problem before it spirals out of control. All of this is just about a question of political will. It's not really even a question of resources, because we're squandering huge amounts of money on police interventions that have just not proven to be effective. And I'll just finish with one last example. There in Jacksonville, political leaders made a decision to do something about the levels of veteran homelessness. After decades of being told, well, there's nothing we can do about homelessness. You know, we have to let the free market, the housing market determine these things. We'll provide a few emergency services, but this is really about personal responsibility and personal choice. Well, they made a decision. No, actually, we could do something about this. And so they have actually built some housing. Not just a shelter, not just a drop-in center, but actually built some housing and put some people in housing. They didn't rely on the free market. They made a decision. And we need to see more of that. It is possible. It could make a tremendous difference, and it would reduce both the levels of police violence and the level of racial tension in so many of our cities. So I'll stop there, and I'm very happy to take some questions. Thank you.
I have a question.